Thank you very much. About the fine wine, I'm looking forward to relaxing this evening with some, because I have not had sufficient fine caffeine or espresso today, so I do my best to get through. I am going to speak more informally than Jens's carefully prepared paper. You saw me this morning, those of you who were here, in a more formal mode, so I will be a bit more informal now. And I have 6 points that I want to make, and then I want to raise 2 questions or clusters of questions at the end of my remarks. So, first of all, my first point, and most of these points are going to repeat or encapsulate or refer back to things that I said this morning, and I will add a few extra comments in relationship to things that Jens has just said as well. So the first is just to repeat the main point that I made this morning, which is that work in and of itself, human labor per se, seems not to have been a major subject for theological or spiritual reflection throughout most of Christian history, whether we're talking about the early church and the patristic era, about the monastic tradition from the Benedictines on in medieval scholasticism. This begins to change somewhat with Renaissance humanism, where we have a stronger emphasis on human capacities for the transformation of the natural environment, on the importance of human institutions, partly inspired by the recovery of strands from ancient culture and history. And here, just in reference to the question that Professor Susan Hansen asked this morning at the end of my talk, it seems to me right to point out that the visual images or references that we see in things like the medieval chanson and so forth to various forms of human labor certainly bespeak some sense of self-awareness and identity, the importance of these respective roles and forms of human work. But it still seems to me striking that there is such a relative absence of explicit theological reflection about work, considering how important and central it has become in modern Catholic social teaching. So that's the main point, the lack of explicit theological reflection and spiritual writing about the meaning of work. That's point 1. Point 2 is just to agree mostly with what Jens said, but then to disagree a little bit, partly in reference to the presentation and one of the points that was made by Professor Father Santi Sanchez this morning. No question that historically there is a major theological impulse that comes into Christian thought and practice about the theological meaning of work from Protestantism before Catholicism, centuries before, beginning with Luther, because and the relationship between his Christology on the one hand and his rejection of a sacerdotal priesthood and the traditional hierarchy between religious and laity on the other. We could talk about the specifics of that, but that would probably be of interest just to Jens and I, maybe to a few other people here. But it does seem to me that the importance from Luther comes from a dual impulse, however we evaluate the connection to his Christology. And that is his rejection of religious, so-called, he would say, religious actions contributing to human salvation in any way, and therefore instead valuing anything and everything in everyday human life, but crucially, so long as it is done with the certainty of faith. If it's not, then it's actually worse for Luther, but that's a whole nother question. The second, and I think more important, is his affirmation, his notion of what's called the priesthood of all believers, and then his esteem not only for the working maid, but for butchers and bakers and candlestick makers as being just as holy, just as much a sacred vocation as members of the clergy. who now he reinterprets and understands in a very different way, just as he rejects the notion of the Mass as a sacrifice, as ministers of the Word and sacrament, and then, of course, rejects the notion of particular monastic life as being in any sense holier, more sacred, in any way closer to God than is an ordinary lay vocation. Now, the reason it gives me pause to, well, there are a number of things. One I will mention, it gives me pause to talk about Catholic social teaching as appropriating the fullness of what Luther says, is because it doesn't appropriate the fullness. The valuation of the lay vocations of work in modern Catholic social teaching does not come with the other theological meanings and ramifications that we see in Luther or indeed in other Protestant reformers in the 16th century. And I think this is part of the point that Santi Sanchez was getting at in his presentation. So looking forward, and I agree with you completely, Jens, I'm all for ecumenical cooperation whenever possible, and I think it should be as robust and strong and decisive as possible. But it seems to me also that it should be done on the basis of a genuine shared understanding and commitment to. So I'm all for going as far as possible with whatever is overlapping, but I don't think that we can go all the way in that respect, because the theological relationship of the valuation of lay vocation in Protestantism is fundamentally different in important ways, it seems to me, than it is in Catholicism. And this goes back to Santi's point. Okay, that's point number two. That was, it had to be elaborated because of things that Jens said. Point number three, much of what we could have imagined might have been, if that's not a strange locution, those of you whose English is good will follow that, might have been directed toward Catholic theological reflection about work and vocation, instead, historically, was directed toward the difference between one's status, or one's station in life, we might put it, in the sense of a calling that is applied to one. The key difference is, are you called to be a member of the clergy or religious, or are you called, right, to be a member of the laity in the married state? That is the key distinction that absorbs a lot of attention when we get into later questions about discernment and so forth. There's much more attention in the Catholic tradition devoted to the clerical and religious calling than there is to the lay calling. Throughout the vast majority of Catholic history, that seems to me simply a matter of basic historical record. And then the distinction between so there's more attention given to the distinction between the religious and the ecclesiastical. Aquinas devotes 11 questions to one of those two, and he devotes 0 to the laity. So we can see there's one example of the relative significance. So that's point number 3. Point number 4 is that in the 16th and the 17th century, as I mentioned this morning, we see increased Catholic attention to the question of discernment, especially coming from the Jesuit tradition with Ignatian, the Ignatian spiritual exercises, additional attention to devotion, and additional attention to choosing a station in life. The key distinction, again, being clerical versus lay. One of my PhD students, Christopher Lane, finished a dissertation in 2015 about this, particularly in 17th century France, a dissertation called The Diversity of Vocations, Choosing a State of Life in 17th century France, in which he goes into this in quite a lot of detail. But the key distinction here, again, even in the 16th and the 17th century, remains between clerical religious on the one hand or lay and married on the other. It is not discernment about within the lay state what sort of occupation are you going to undertake. In other words, what I think many ministers or priests, whether Protestant or Catholic today, regard as an instinctive, obvious question. When a young person comes to you and says, what should I do with my life, right? Some form of, well, how best can you use your gifts, right? What kinds of talents do you have that what might God be calling you to? Within a lay vocation. That is simply not on the drawing board in the 16th and the 17th centuries within Catholicism. And that seems to me a very big difference from the present. Point number 5, again, repeating what I said this morning, serious engagement with vocation, specifically the notion of vocation across the board, applying to Christians, whether lay or clerical in Catholicism, comes relatively late, starting really in the 19th century. And again, it seems to me it's the result not of a reflection internal to theology. And here I would say, this is it's a caveat as well, Jens, to your point about the influence of Protestantism on modern Catholic social thought. Historically, I'm not sure that that's true. I'm not sure that there are Protestant influences on its emergence in the 20th century, even though both are talking about the importance of lay vocation. In other words, I think more of the impetus in Catholicism is a response to conditions driven by industrialization, rather than, gosh, the Protestants had a really good point here, and we better get on board as well. But we'll come back to that. I'm sorry, see, that wasn't fair, because I made it like it was a dialogue, but I just said one point. Yeah, all right. So because with industrialization, the radical transformation of society brings in so many things that have their center in work. The question of the creation of factories, urbanization on a scale never seen before in the West, mobility of populations, the massive move from rural areas to these cities, increased consumption, increased opportunities for education, the creation of much greater quantities of wealth and how it's to be distributed and so forth. The Catholic theology of work and a Catholic theology of vocation go together. They emerge and become part of modern Catholic social teaching largely because of the pressures put on society and on theological reflection, indeed, by industrialization. And point number 6, again, it's just repeating, really. It seems to me only since the Second Vatican Council has there been an explicit, official, magisterial emphasis, or perhaps even official recognition within the Catholic magisterium on all Catholics having a vocation. A vocation is not something that simply, if you're going to be a priest or a religious, whether male or female, you have a vocation, and everyone else does not. No, everyone has a vocation, whether clerical or lay, with all called to holiness in their respective type of work. And in this sense, I think I agree entirely with your point, Jens. The equal worth of all forms of human work and the affirmation of every profession. Those two things, per se, I think are shared. But the associated theologies, I think, not necessarily so. This, too, and here we have not just the affirmation of the Second Vatican Council, but a very interesting discussion earlier today with Father Francisco Inza about, has anyone documented whether, and if so, to the extent that Saint Jose Maria Escrivá influenced the Second Vatican Council specifically on these points, because things he was writing decades before Lumen Gentium and in the other documents absolutely show up there. So there's a doctoral dissertation topic for somebody if the work hasn't already been done. 2 questions, clusters of questions, also returning in some ways to what I suggested at the end of my talk this morning. First one, is a Christian emphasis on vocation, the way we've been talking about it much of today, in a spirituality of work, suited to or even dependent on certain specific kinds of socioeconomic and political arrangements rather than others? And is it in jeopardy now? This goes to Jens's point about the danger of technology to work. It's also related to the presentation I was happy to hear from Professor Valerio Fratocci, yes, right there, about Uruguay, adapting a study from the United States that in the US says over the next 20 years, 47% of jobs currently in existence are going to be gone, and 54% in Uruguay. Now, if this is even remotely close, even if it's half that, it's a serious, serious problem. Is it this notion then of vocation within work, the way we think about work in relationship to our relationship to God and faith and so forth, in serious jeopardy because of the realities that so many young people are facing in countries as a result of automation, of globalization, of the disappearance of so many jobs and certain types of jobs, not only from Western Europe and North America, but also Latin America and other countries as well. So in other words, might the notion of vocation itself, in the way in which it's reflected on within Christianity, be something that is characteristic especially of the conditions of modernity? Meaningful degrees of educational and socioeconomic opportunity, conditions more or less of political stability, emphases on individual freedom and self-determination, and crucially, corporate concern for employees. More emphasis on employees and being loyal to them, for example, than on whether or not your shareholders are getting a certain return. And if they're not, well, maybe consolidate those companies, get rid of a few thousand people, and you've got happy shareholders, but you also have thousands of unemployed people. In other words, it might be much less applicable either to the conditions that we're seeing in those terms about with respect to the future, and also, just as it was less applicable, it seems to me, to pre-modern realities in which most people were illiterate, worked in an agricultural capacity, and really had little choice. The question, what do you want to do with your life? That doesn't mean anything, really, to a medieval peasant. It simply doesn't. You just do what you have to do. Okay, that's the first, well, it's more than one question. It was like 9, but they're all related. The second cluster of questions, I wonder whether different sorts of Christian theologies or spiritualities of work are simply more suited to different kinds of dominant conditions of human labor. So perhaps in situations where, whether we're talking about medieval Europe or whether we're talking about contemporary rural India, in situations where people have few opportunities, they have little choice, and they face largely grinding, unfulfilling kinds of labor, is work then in a Christian context likely to be more a matter of co-suffering and suffering with Christ? As opposed to situations in which people have lots of opportunities, relatively speaking, significant choices, and prospects of fulfillment and using one's gifts. Then, yes, work as vocation, as discernment, as answering God's call, persevering in it, sanctifying the workplace. How can we bring Christ more fully and into the fabric of the wider society? And then, yet again, looking more toward the future, or what the future may hold, I hope not, perhaps still significant opportunities, significant choices, but much greater unpredictability, much more uncertainty from decisions and policies that are largely either actually or perceived to be beyond one's control. Then the mentality then of constant retooling, of reskilling, of being adaptable, of learning new skills all the time. Why? Because the ones that you learned might be redundant in a matter of years, depending on how technology advances, on how uncertain larger global decision making is done with respect to the economy. In this instance then, it seems to me we might see the emergence of a different kind of Christian spirituality and theology of work, one that adapts to that uncertainty, that regards our lives more in the image of the Son of Man who had nowhere to lay his head, of our lives as an uncertain peregrinatio and pilgrimage. So those are my 8 long-winded points. Thank you.